It's time to turn to the WUKY sports page with your host, Keith Elkins, revealing conversations and stories you thought you knew from prominent Kentucky sports figures. Now, here once again is Keith Elkins.
Jerry Tipton is with us today. He covered University of Kentucky basketball for 41 seasons before retiring in 2022. He was also on the UK football beat from 1981 through 1986. He is a native of Michigan. And, Jerry, I'm going to ask you the pronunciation of your hometown in Michigan, just outside Detroit.
You're not the first person to ask me that.
At least I'm asking, right?
It's not actually outside Detroit. It's a little odd that there are two independent towns inside the Detroit city limits. Mm-hmm. And Highland Park is one. That's not my hometown. But do you remember Bobby? You may not be old enough. Bobby Joe Hill played for Texas Western, two famous steals, and that he was from Highland Park, and I was from Hamtramck. Hamtramck. That's the other one. And it's named after, I think it was a French soldier, Jean Francis Hamtramck, I think. But anyway, it's, it was like growing up in a small town surrounded by a major metropolitan city.
Hamtramck.
Right.
Okay, I've got it now, I think. But, that reminds me of Ernie Harwell, the great Tigers announcer. And when a foul ball was hit into the stands, he'd always name a random Michigan town and say that the fan who caught the ball was from there. So there are probably a few Hamtramcks that caught.
I never heard Hamtramck mentioned, and I listened to Ernie. Like the cliche goes, he was the voice of summer. Mm-hmm. And I would carry my little transistor radio around and listen to the Tiger games.
Hamtramck, Michigan. And he came to Lexington, though, from Huntington, West Virginia, where Jerry graduated from Marshall University, worked for the Huntington Herald-Dispatch. He was inducted into the U.S. Basketball Writers Association Hall of Fame in 2005, the Marshall University Journalism Hall of Fame in 2018, and the Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame in 2020. And he has recently written a book titled Deja Blue, Sportswriter Reflects on 41 seasons of Kentucky basketball. And, Jerry, first of all, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Keith.
Sports writing was not your first choice, as I understand it. You were going to be a math teacher, right?
Well, a high school math teacher just made an impression on me, a good impression. And I wasn't smart enough to, know to think of even sports writing. And so I thought, I remember one day in class, the math teacher mentioned the Tigers. Mm-hmm. And said, boy, how about the Tigers game last night? And I was charmed by that. So I thought, okay, I'll be a math teacher. And I had an uncle who had gone to Marshall, was a Marshall graduate, and he was kind of guiding me. And he asked me early on in that first semester what I was majoring in, and I said math. And he kind of frowned and shook his head, and I knew, But anyway, that first semester, it wasn't going well. The math teacher was it was an introductory class. And I think he was from Greece, and he spoke in broken English. It was hard to understand him. So anyway, one day my uncle was asking me, he would check in on me, how's it going? And I said, I think I have to change majors. And he said, well, what are you going to change to? And I said, I don't know. And he knew I liked sports a lot. He said, what about being a sports writer? And ding, I thought, yeah, what about that? That made sense. He didn't know that I'd always liked words, learning new words and wordplay and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So it made sense on two levels to me.
Part of your experience at Marshall was one of the real sports tragedies of the last century, the Marshall plane crash, the football team involved in a plane crash in Huntington in the fall of 1970. Now, you were a student at Marshall at that time, and knowing a little bit about Huntington and just imagining the importance of Marshall University and Marshall University athletics, this had a tremendous impact on the entire community, the entire region, but I would think particularly right there on campus.
Well, it was, it was like surreal. At least you hoped it was surreal. And I remember that whole weekend, I knew it wasn't going to happen, but I kept wishing it didn't happen. This is some sort of collective nightmare, and we'll wake up from it. Mm-hmm. And, of course, my realistic self knew that it had happened. I just didn't want it to happen, and I, just thought if I just keep hoping, because it seemed so unreal. And a month before, there was a football team plane crash, and I'm trying to remember.
Wichita State. So twice in like a month's time, that seemed that couldn't have happened. But anyway, part of you knew,
And you just had to, that feeling of not wanting to believe. That night, it was kind of a misty, kind of a cloudy night. And I remember I went for a walk with a dorm buddy. We just, you felt helpless just sitting in the dorm room. So you felt like you got to do something, even if it's not going to be helpful. So we went for a walk and talked about it. And the next day, it was so bright and sunny that it hurt your eyes to look out the, how you have to kind of avert your eyes because it's so bright. And that to me kind of lent that surreal quality to the night before, like maybe. But of course it happened. And, it's something you never forget.
Yeah, and you've had a personal connection in that a very good friend of yours was a team manager who, as fate would have it, was not on the plane that night.
Yeah, they drove the equipment in a truck. We didn't know that, those of us in the dorm. And this was before cell phones and texting and all of that. So we just had to wait. And at least I was just sitting there waiting. On Sunday, hopefully his name was David Bird, hopefully he'll be there. He'll show up. And he did. And we're still friends. We still communicate and meet from time to time. So
you talk in the book about, write in the book about your learning experiences along the way that have made you a better writer as you went along and contributed to your career, and a lot of those occurred in Huntington, and of course we'll get to your time in Lexington here in just a few moments, but I did want to ask you about a couple of those, one being that your sports editor in Huntington, whom you credit a great deal for your success, would edit your stories, as any editor would do, but everything from a few changes to a complete rewrite. And people who write for a living, or even if they're just getting started in their careers, there's a great deal of pride in every word, so you have to. There's a barrier of acceptance, you might say, I guess, to say that even the sports editor can go ahead and edit your copy. He's your boss technically, but it's still hard to overcome.
Not technically. He was the boss, and he had come from the news side. He was like an assistant editor on the news side, and he didn't want to come to sports. They had the sports editor, I don't remember, but left or something. And they just basically made him do it. And so he brought a news judgments mentality to sports. He wasn't a fan in any way. And, of course, but way back then, my pride was more on the line with the words that I used, and I definitely was not ready for having something completely rewritten. But I had to admit his version was better. So I tried to learn from it, and, and I talked to him more recently. I talked to him for the book, and I talked to a lot of people for it. And he was one, and he told me that later in his career, somebody either quit or he had to fire them because they wouldn't accept their stories being rewritten that way.
Another learning experience that occurred there in Huntington involved another beat that you were on for a while, and that was bowling. And while your career was dominated by basketball, particularly here in Kentucky, but there was at least one really good lesson that you took from your bowling experience. And tell me about that.
Yeah, I know some people kind of saw that as a way to dismiss me in a way, was saying, well, he's a former bowling writer. And I was right out of college, and so I needed any and all the experience I could get. And my first beat was Ohio High Schools, the newspaper in Huntington, circulated in southern Ohio. And they said they wanted me to take either bowling or outdoors. And I'd never gone hunting, and I had no desire. There's no hunting in Detroit. I had no desire to go hunting. And fishing, I'd gone once and literally caught a shoe. Okay. So, so I picked bowling. I had bowled recreation. So I took that, and the learning experience was, I don't know if you want me to get into that, but when somebody would bowl a big game or a big series, they would the bowling house, they didn't like to be called an alley, would report that to the local secretary of the bowling association. And the secretary would come out and inspect everything, make sure everything was legit and okay. And then report to the national office that this person had bowled this big game or series, and then the national office would send the bowler a certificate, recognizing it. So anyway, the local bowling secretary went to the lanes and found that they were not oiled properly. That you can oil a lane to cut down on the friction of the ball going over the wood, so the wood will last longer, I think. But anyway, but you can also oil them to where the ball's more likely to roll into the pocket, as they call it.
Yeah, and this is a big deal in bowling.
Well, yeah. And so the either big game or series was not going to be recognized. So I thought this was a story. Mm-hmm. So I wrote the story, and it wasn't well received, especially by the bowling house. And they called for a meeting, and the sports editor and I went, and some other people. And I kept my head down, but the only thing I was thinking was what was wrong with what I wrote. And nobody ever pointed out anything mistaken. They just thought it shouldn't have been written. Mm-hmm. It wasn't good for business, would be my conclusion. Yeah. And so I went up to the bowling owner afterwards and just told him it wasn't anything personal. I was just doing my job. Well, he said he didn't accept that because not after all the tuna fish sandwiches he'd bought me. And I had gone, I would go on Fridays to get the scores from the bowling houses. There were 3 in Huntington, and there was one in Ashland, Kentucky, and Ashland would mail me their scores, big scores. And there was a list of, big scores with the notes column. So anyway, I thought he was just being nice because his house was the last one I would go to, and then I might get a tuna fish sandwich for lunch. Mm-hmm. And if he was there and saw me, he'd come over and offer to pay for it. I thought he was just being nice. I didn't know this was like a transactional thing. So it was a lesson learned. Mm-hmm. And I know they said in journalism school at Marshall, and I'm sure everywhere, don't accept free stuff,
right.
But I naively thought tuna fish sandwich. What's the big deal?
Right.
Well, it was a big deal.
Yeah. Well, let's get you to Lexington here. You were hired as the beat writer, UK football and basketball. This was
at the start,
81, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Fall of 81.
Yeah. And so now this was something you had, I guess, looked around a couple of times in Huntington, but this was something you really wanted, right? You wanted this position.
Well, it was definitely a step up.
Yeah.
And, Kentucky basketball, blue blood program, and all that, no doubt. I was very happy in Huntington. I mean, it wasn't anything to do with, I got to get out of here.
Right.
I really loved working for the sports editor. I felt depended upon, and I felt like I would be called upon, and I thought, sort of inspired me to try to get better, to try to, do a good job. And then I didn't know anybody in Lexington, and it wasn't as easy as it would seem it was, but ultimately, it was a step up and a really good beat covering Kentucky, especially basketball. So it felt like something I should do. I had some reservation about leaving a job that I really liked, but it was something I should do.
And at the time that you got here, of course, Joe B. Hall was the coach in basketball, and he was had been a national championship coach in 1978. He had established himself over the years since he had replaced Adolph Rupp, but there was always that for Joe. It was people called him the defender of the program, and someone who he felt like, especially maybe having grown up here, that he was carrying the torch, and so that affected his the way he went about things, especially as it was in the case of dealing with reporters sometimes, and people who remember him. And of course, we all saw him grow old and live a long life and be a radio host, a very jovial person. And there were people who would tell you at the time that this is how he is away from basketball. But when you see him on the basketball floor when he was coaching, he was all business, to say the least, right?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of pressure with being the Kentucky basketball coach. And I always like to say, like any double dribble could lead to a controversy, and because the fans care so much. which I thought was very good. I really like that. And I think any reporter wants to cover something that the readers or the viewers or the listeners are really into. And so I never worried about that. I knew the readers were into it. And Joe B., I always wanted to like the coach because I didn't want, things weren't going to always go the way the reporter wants them to go. And I didn't want to hold a grudge or not be happy about that. So I would always try, and there were 6 coaches I covered with Kentucky basketball, and I tried to find something about each coach that I really liked. And so when those moments came, when I might be unhappy about something, I would think, okay, with Joe B., it was the fact that he grew up in Cynthiana nearby, and he was a fan, and now a fan becomes the coach. I thought that was really charming. And so I clung to that. And he had a sense of humor, and I always liked that. And so, I didn't want to say, oh, man, that guy, because I was afraid it would creep into the stories.
Mm-hmm. And you were dealing with him during the season, I guess, nearly every day, so that would affect.
Well, back then it was a lot different because the media could go to any practice. And, you could interact with people, and you kind of got to know them better as people. And, I thought that was healthy. I can't speak for the coach, whether the coach would think that was a good thing. But, of course, it's changed, I think, over time to where it's a much more controlled environment.
Yeah, very structured now.
And back then, like I remember one year when Eddie Sutton was coach, it was Thanksgiving, and they practiced 3 times that day and evening. And I went to all 3. I had no family in Lexington. And it was entertainment, and maybe I could pick up something. So I went to all 3 practices.
Marta McMacken, who was the administrative assistant for basketball, 1976 to 2007, I believe you stated in the book, and you talked to her at length about some of the coaches, and of course she worked for several of them. But her quote on Joe Hall was, "If you got him away from basketball, he was a genuinely good person." And that's not to say he wasn't a good person when he was a coach, but the difference was there, and that was something that I think fortunately the public got to see later. But again, it could be difficult at times during his career.
Yeah, I had heard that from people that had covered way before me, like Billy Reed, that Joe B., when he was an assistant coach, was a different person, outgoing and happy and friendly and all of that stuff. But then when he became the head coach, and as you know, Adolph Rupp was second guessing him publicly. That I remember talking to John Calipari. For some reason, at a press conference, John mentioned how much he likes former coaches, and they'd been in the chair and so on. So I went up to him afterwards and told him, by the way, I don't know if you know, but Adolph Rupp publicly second guessed Joe B. And he got this shocked look on his face, like it was hard to believe. And I didn't know that when I came. This was part of the learning process. But it made me more sympathetic to Joe B. and the job he had.
One of the early issues in your career, and more or less toward the end of Joe B. Hall's career, the last part of it anyway, was the Kentucky versus Louisville regular season series. And now it's such a part of a staple of every basketball season for Louisville and Kentucky fans. But at that time, they hadn't played for many years, and got together in the tournament in '83. But of course, it can happen in the tournament. But the regular season series started the next year. But it was, to say the least, a bumpy road to get there. And one of the contentious issues was whether there was actually a policy about Kentucky playing in-state schools, right?
Well, they would, when media would ask about it, and Kentucky was resisting it. Louisville wanted to play, and Denny Crum publicly was lobbying for it. UK people would cite, they would just say there's a policy we have that we don't play in-state schools. So I got the idea one day that I'll do an open records request and get a copy of the policy and read it. And, and then that's when I learned that there wasn't a written policy. It was just sort of, I guess, understanding.
Right.
And I think I wrote that. Hopefully I did.
Well, along about that same time, one of the other stories, big stories from the Joe B. Hall era, was your coverage of Sam Bowie and his struggle to get his playing career underway and to be on the court full time. Of course, he missed 2 full seasons.
My first 2 seasons were the seasons he sat out.
Yeah, and you talked with him, I would guess, at some length, and he was very open about what a struggle that was for him.
Yeah, he didn't. You didn't know that at the time. You could kind of surmise it, but yeah, I mean, you kind of put a brave face on, and he does, the player does. But then, I didn't want a memoir. This may sound illogical, but I didn't want the memoir to be about me, at least not totally.
Right.
So I talked to more than 40 people to try to get at least something of a historical feel to it. And basically focusing on the time I was covering. And Sam, I thought, was really good. I thought he came across as, I did a lot of what he told me I didn't know. That was the first time I had heard it. And it made sense to me. And I remember in his second year, and I touch on this, they were going to play a practice scrimmage, and he was going to play in it for the first time. And I was really looking forward to that because I'd heard, you heard a lot about Sam Bowie and how good he was. And I remember kind of, I was thinking, he hasn't played in almost 2 years, so don't expect too much, And they played, and I thought he was the best player on the court, And it made you think, boy, if he had been healthy, that would have made a real difference, I think.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned talking to him and many others for the book, and
Right.
let me go ahead and ask you about that now, because there is a lengthy list of people that you talked with, and they were this was, I guess, in 2023 when just before the book came out. So you were doing this just in advance of the book, but people like Dwayne Casey and Sam Bowie, and more recently Kellen Grady, and they all seem to be very open with you, and that I would think is partly in recognition of your expertise and longevity, but they really seem to be very open about things.
Yeah, I thought, of course, they're not under the microscope once they're done playing. So I thought maybe they'll be a little more relaxed and reflective, and they'd had time since they played to think about how it went and what it meant to them. So I talked to former players and former coaches and Marta McMacken and a bunch of people that I could think of to try, like I say, to kind of expand or expound upon their time at Kentucky. And we did touch, I guess it would be natural they would think I'd want to know about my presence there and what it meant. So there was some of that. But that wasn't what I was necessarily shooting for.
Your second basketball coach that you worked with at Kentucky was Eddie Sutton, and he, of course, on the court anyway, got off to a great start at UK, and later in his career had success at Oklahoma State. But his alcohol issue was part of his entire tenure at Kentucky. Rex Chapman, who you talked with, mentioned several situations, including the very public one, the press conference, I believe, after the Louisville game, and that was during Chapman's freshman year, and he'd had such a spectacular game. But how did that affect your relationship with Eddie Sutton, and how did you try to handle all of that?
Well, it was interesting that, I felt like, you heard, I remember I was talking to a sports writer, this is very early on. He was from the Midwest or the Great Plains. I don't remember exactly, but he brought up alcoholism. That's the first I'd heard of it. I was unaware. And so it was in my mind, and then of course, you would hear things, but I didn't want to write anything unless, basically, I figured, and maybe I was wrong, that nobody would just come right out and talk about it. So there had to be a record of something like a drunk driving arrest or something. So I was waiting for that to build, a story around. And as far as I know, that there wasn't any record like that. Maybe there was, and I missed it. And I remember talking to somebody that covered Eddie Sutton when he was at Arkansas, and they had the same sort of approach, that they were waiting for something documented, and there wasn't. But it was a known thing, or at least a thing talked about, that there was a drinking issue.
Yeah, and that brings up an issue that the beat writer is going to face. I mean, you might hear from fans saying, "Hey, how come you don't write about this?" And of course, if you wrote about it, then there'd be fans saying, "Why did you write about that?" But the idea that you're waiting for documentation, that's the way the business should work, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, especially on something that could blow up in your face
that probably would.
if it's not correct.
Yeah.
So it's obviously safer to have documentation.
Well, something that did blow up on everybody was the Emory package what led to the dismissal of Eddie Sutton and a downturn in the Kentucky program. And I think I remember you saying in the book that you got a call from Mike Johnson, who was a sports editor, saying that the story broke in Los Angeles, right? Los Angeles Daily News is that a Emory package intended for recruit Chris Mills had broken open, and there was $1,000 in it being sent from Kentucky. And of course, everything went, you might say, downhill from there, and it certainly changed your life for the next year or so, I would think. What happened there, and how did that change your life?
Oh, well, I was at my apartment, and the phone rang, and it was Mike Johnson, the sports editor, and he told me that, and my heart sank. Because you knew immediately, okay, an NCAA investigation, there's probably going to be penalties. They're going to fire Eddie Sutton and his coaches, so we'll have a coaching search. Both of those things I was hoping never to have to deal with,
yes.
Coaching search and NCAA investigation. So there it was. And that season, it was, I had to kind of stay close to home. And so there were several away games I didn't go to because there were stories in that vein that I had to work on. And so it wasn't any fun at all. And you knew ultimately how this was going to play out, you felt like. And it was, a lot of pressure and, fortunately it just happened once,
yes.
Thankfully.
Yeah. Now the next year, after Rick Pitino's first year, turned out to be a team that I believe you called the most fun to cover in the entire 41-year career. But in between that, in the Pitino hiring, you did a story that about a rules violation that he was involved in very early in his career out in Hawaii, and that caused some stir, as you might expect. In fact, it looked like it might derail not the story necessarily, but they might make a decision not to hire Pitino as a result of that. Knowing about that, right?
Well, I had heard. I don't remember for sure, but I think I had heard that this might have been the case. So I think I called the University of Hawaii, and they sent me documentation, and I got information from the Honolulu paper too. So now what? So, this was before Pitino was, the prime guy. So I decided, maybe I was wrong, to just hold on to it. And if Rick Pitino becomes a real candidate, then write it. And so I had heard that he was coming to town, and C.M. Newton, the athletic director, they were going to go to dinner at the coach house. So, okay, it's on. So I got to do it. So I went out to the coach house to bounce it off of them. And, I think CM said that he was aware of it all, and maybe he was. I wondered if he really was. And then Rick Pitino kind of dismissed it as nothing important. So I wrote the story, and of course, I don't think he was pleased. But I think the president, David Rozelle, thought Rick Pitino was, an excellent choice. And so, okay, we're aware of this, but we think it'll work.
Yeah.
And so they hired him,
yeah,
which was fine.
Right.
I wasn't trying to derail it.
Sure.
But to me, if I'm Kentucky, I'd rather have it come out before the official hiring, deal with it, and then move on rather than the season's underway. And
yeah. But C.M. Newton had some serious reservations then at that point, before Dr. Rozelle had the interview with Pitino.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
I mean, and the fact that they were on probation,
that was the key.
That was, it made a difference in trying to assess, is this a story to go with or not? If they hadn't been on probation. And I remember I'd forgotten it until I was working on the book that I think the University of Hawaii coach or someone out there said any coach would probably have some NCAA problems in his past.
Right, and the context, of course, being not only for your story, but C.M. Newton having some reservations at that point. Kentucky was dealing with this serious problem that had basically wrecked the program for a year or so, and so the next step was going to be a really important one. So they did have to take a hard look at things, didn't they?
Well, yeah, I thought so. I mean, I thought it had news value.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of dismissed it as, nothing happened. But I thought it was more significant than, I bought somebody a hamburger.
Yeah, right. Or tuna fish sandwich.
Right. Exactly.
Now, you called, as I mentioned a moment ago, Pitino's first team the most fun to cover over your long career of covering UK basketball. And those of us who remember that team remember the hustle and the three-pointers and this new style of play and this new young coach. All those things contributed to it. But what made it the most fun as far as your aspect was concerned?
Well, I like to, I always thought that the fans did not see the games as competition. They saw the games as demonstrations of Kentucky's superiority. The Kentucky was the Globetrotters, and everybody else was the Washington Generals.
Yes.
You have to have another team out there to have a game, but the other team's job is to lose by a lot.
Yeah.
And that year, there were no expectations because they were on probation and the best players had transferred away. This was before the portal, so it was unusual. And I remember Catewood Ledford, the iconic radio play-by-play guy, I think he said something like before the season they might win 8 games. He either said 6 or 8. It was single digits, and whoa, for Kentucky, that really got your attention. So anyway, no expectations, we're Kentucky, and all that stuff. And, of course, they didn't like Eddie Sutton's playing style. It was slow, too slow. And so Pitino comes, and it's, shooting threes like crazy and pressing and trapping and all that. It was constant action. And they were really competing, which I think the fans had a new appreciation for that, with Kentucky as sort of the underdog now. And they're really going after it. And I remember Johnny McGill was the sports columnist at the Herald-Leader, and he dubbed that Pitino team the Pitino's Bombinos.
Yes.
And they, they were fun to watch with the threes and everything. It was an unusual style, to say the least. And I think they had a lot of fun, too, the players. And their final record was 14-14, which by Kentucky standards is not good at all. But I think the fans, they were just joyful and happy, and that was refreshing.
Yeah, the fans loved the new coach and loved the approach, and also, as you say, there was no competition type stress, because if Catewood Ledford predicts 8 games, you win more than 8. I mean, you're rolling. Then
it's been a big success.
And had a huge win over a very talented LSU team.
That still blows my mind that they beat Shaquille O'Neal, Stanley Roberts, and Chris Jackson. I looked up the box score. I don't know if it's in the book, but LSU had 27 turnovers in that game. So obviously that was a factor.
You, of course, covered Pitino's teams throughout his stretch of his career here. Fans, of course, admired what he was able to do in turning the program around. So he was a very, very popular coach. What was your relationship like with him? Because he usually wears the emotions on the sleeve. But what was it like?
Well, it wasn't real. I mean, it wasn't like big buddies and all that stuff. I remember one time he was at his restaurant, Bravo Pitino, and for some reason I went over there maybe to talk to him. I don't remember. But anyway, he needed a ride back to his office on campus, so I gave him a ride, and it was nice. Another time, my wife and I think with another couple, went to Bravo Pitino, and they bought us a bottle of wine, which I probably shouldn't have accepted, but I did. And so, it wasn't openly contentious, but it wasn't warm and fuzzy. He didn't confide in me, which is, I don't think any of the coaches did, really.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like so contentious that I thought, oh man, what's going to happen next?
Yeah. Did you ever think a working relationship, a professional relationship with a coach would be permanently damaged by something that happened, an encounter that you had, and where you think, oh, we need to fix this, or we're not going to be able to go on?
Well, it was usually a story that you worried would ruin things, and you had to take that into account because you want to you want to get along, and so the coach will, if not confide in you, at least answer your questions and all of that sort of thing. And so there's I wish I could say, well, just do X and Y, but I don't know what X and Y are. I just kind of went along and tried to be objective and tried to be honest. I didn't try to fool whoever the coach was, or didn't try to play like I was a big fan when I wasn't. I tried to be honest, and I hoped that would, pay dividends.
One thing that you point out at several different stages of the book is that how much you appreciated the opportunity to be involved in big games, Final Fours, events that were at the top of the charts in college basketball. And, we talk about some of the stories that caused controversy or some of the times that you had to ask the tough questions. But you also, you got to do things that you really enjoyed, too. And I guess that would be right at the top of the list, wasn't it? The big events, the championships?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's one reason why I hung around for 41 seasons. If you were miserable, it would be hard to...
That's a long time.
That's a long time. And I know the cliche in journalism is that... journalism is the first draft of history. And I think that applied on occasion with Kentucky, like the Christian Laettner game comes immediately to mind. Right. And other games, advancements to the Final Four, and other games and situations. And, it's kind of a privilege to be in a position where you can try to form the first draft of history. Something that hasn't been forgotten decades later.
You worked with Tubby Smith during his entire tenure here, and when I think about what you said about finding something to like about a coach, I would think that's probably not very difficult with Tubby Smith, because he is, he's very competitive, he's tough, but he was a nice person who really could show empathy for others and seemed never to make a big deal of himself. But what was the relationship like with him, and what did you find to like about him?
Well, to me, it was the humanity of the man. You felt like he wasn't just Tubby Smith, the coach. You felt like you were getting a sense of a caring person. And the other person, in my case, the media person, mattered too. It wasn't just the coach. And I think coaches, by definition, are authority figures, and they dictate. They're kind of dictators. Mm-hmm. And I remember doing a story, I don't know if I put it in the book, but during COVID, I did a story about how coaches want to control. But with COVID, they lost at least some of their control because, they had to do Zoom, and I think some of them didn't like that, stuff like that. And, I thought that was interesting. And but Tubby, he never struck me that way as kind of a dictator. He seemed very human, and like I say, the other person mattered. And there's a famous incident, I don't know if you want me to get into it, sure. When they played at Georgia, his number one assistant took his place at Georgia, right. Ron Jerza. Mm-hmm. And they were, I think, pretty good friends in addition to working together. And so Kentucky goes down to play there in the Tubby's second season here, and already Jerza's on the hot seat. The fans are unhappy. So they play. And a really good game. Game goes into overtime. Kentucky wins. And part of the game story was that Jerza changed defenses going into overtime, and it didn't work. Kentucky seized on it and pulled away and won. So in the post-game press conference, and I wrote about this in the Herald-Leader more than once because I was so struck with it, a reporter for the Georgia student paper, you could hear nervousness in his voice, and he asked Tubby, basically, and I'm not quoting here, boy, did Ron Jerza really screw up when he changed defenses? Well, Tubby, he didn't want to go there. Sure. So he kind of scolded the reporter and student reporter, and then concluded it by saying, "What team have you ever coached?" So we go to the next question. And as Tubby's responding, you can just sort of tell there's something on his mind. He seems distracted. But he finishes, and then he turns back to the student and apologizes, basically, and tells him, ask me the question again. So this time the student's a little more relaxed in his voice, and he asks again. And then Tubby responded in a more polite way.
Yeah.
And I just thought at the time, how many coaches would do that?
Not many.
Yeah,
Not many.
I don't think
that's
so.
That's got to be a short list.
Yeah.
When I think back to the Tubby Smith tenure, and I don't guess you ever had problems with access or his answering of questions, except that occasionally he would answer a question and just stop in the middle of his answer, and you would have to write "his voice trailed off." I know you had to use that expression on a number of occasions. Just the way the man spoke. That's just his style of speaking. But,
yeah, I guess. To be honest, I don't remember that exactly, but. Yeah, I was just, like I say, I was struck by the humanity of the person.
Sure.
And he said, I seem to remember his father kind of influenced him that way, to be thoughtful of the other person.
Yeah. Well, eventually, Tubby Smith moves on to Minnesota. There was a couple of years where recruiting quality was beginning to decline, and the pressure was growing, and he decided to make that move. And Billy Gillespie is the Kentucky coach. We all know that it didn't work out long term, but one of the keys to that seemed to be just his inability to grasp all the things that go along with being the Kentucky coach in addition to coaching basketball. Is that the way you saw it at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. He was, it wasn't a good fit. Mm-hmm. And, I remember this was, I believe, at the SEC tournament, his second and last year. And coincidentally or not, I was asking him something. It was away from the podium. And I said, I basically made a reference to the Kentucky coach being a celebrity. And he objected to that and, didn't accept that. And coincidentally or not, he was let go shortly thereafter. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, I seem to remember that being cited, not my thing, but just the fact that he had rejected the idea of being a celebrity.
Yeah.
If you remember, he didn't go to the Lexington Rotary Club. Yes. Mm-hmm. And, that was a tradition that went back to Adolph Rupp. And so I remember doing a story on that. That to me is newsy if the tradition that goes back that far is interrupted.
Well, he was succeeded by John Calipari, and, of course, John Calipari was already among the most well-known names in basketball, so it wasn't like you were looking up information maybe that you wanted to find new information, of course, but not like you were being introduced to him or anything. So what did you think your relationship would be with him, and did it actually turn out to be what you maybe had as your first thought?
Well, it was okay. Again, it wasn't confiding in me with secrets in the program. But, I remember early on he would kind of poke at me in press conference situations, and I didn't know what to make of that. I didn't know what to, how to put that in context. And John Clay, columnist with the Herald-Leader, we were talking about it, and he said he thought it was a good thing. It was kind of a playful thing. It wasn't a negative thing. Mm-hmm. So I accepted that, and I think maybe that was true. We went back and forth from times, but I never felt like it was nasty or anything. There was a playful side to it.
Mm-hmm. And of course there was immediate success in a big way, and then in 2012 another national championship team, and I think that was the time, wasn't it, when you were at courtside there in New Orleans and just took it in as one of those moments that you were grateful for, as far as having the opportunity to do what you did.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, any national championship.
Yeah.
They don't happen a lot.
Right. Even here.
Yeah, even here. I think people have a hard time accepting, and I've heard coaches say this, that there's more parity than there used to be, that youth basketball is a much bigger thing than it used to be. So the pool of good players is larger. So it's harder to be Kentucky, to be superior, to where it's not even competitive. It's harder to do that. And I remember one year, I think Tubby was the coach, and they played like South Dakota or South Dakota State at home. And I went to it, and I was thinking, this is going to be boring. This is. And so the games played, and I thought, wait a minute. Kentucky won, but I thought South Carolina or South Dakota or South Dakota State had a couple of players that were good enough that they could have contributed to a Kentucky team. Mm-hmm. And that made an impression on me. And I thought about that. My very last game was St. Peter's.
Yes.
And I thought the same thing. I remember after the game riding on an elevator from the court up to the media workroom, which was where the press conferences would be. And I was on the elevator with two people, part of the Kentucky Media Corps. And I don't want to say who they were, but they were like shocked. How did this happen? This couldn't have happened. And I told them that there's greater parity. And, I remember talking to earlier in the week, I talked to Scott Padgett. He was an assistant coach at Manhattan, same league as St. Peter's. And I thought maybe he'll give me a scouting report. And he did. He seemed very happy. And what he told me made me think, well, I think this could be more competitive than I expect. Now, I still thought Kentucky would win, of course. But I thought it's going to be a competitive game. And then they play, and, I kept waiting for Kentucky to take control. And, of course, it never happened.
Right. That turned out to be the last game that you covered as the beat writer.
Right.
And I remember one time you jokingly said that this was several years before you retired, that your retirement scenario was that you would cover the Maui Invitational and just never come back.
Well, I loved going to Maui. And it caught my ear that when Mark Pope at his introductory, whatever you call that, press conference at Rupp, said that, he'd want Kentucky to play in the Maui Invitational, which I loved going there. It was almost like going to another planet. It was like totally removed from your reality. Mm-hmm. 5 hours difference, that helped to change the reality. And, I don't know how the rebuilding in Lahaina is going. I think they're going to play on Maui. I think the gym that they played in was okay. Mm-hmm. I don't think it was damaged. I may be wrong. But I loved going there.
We talked a little earlier about the give and take sometimes in a news conference setting, and when a coach challenges you or even asks you a question about something like, what right do you have to ask that question? Well, as a human being, you want to respond, but at the same time, you're a reporter, and you've always said, and as it's a tenet of journalism, that you don't want to be the story. And, of course, if you start responding and it's a given back and forth, then you might become the story. But that's a dilemma for a reporter, and so responding is rare, and I guess you'd have to really pick your spots to respond to a coach's challenge like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I somehow, and I wasn't aiming for this, I got a reputation for asking quote-unquote hard questions, and I did a chapter in the memoir on hard questions, and, the idea was, I thought, asking good questions that, I was trying, not every single time, but a lot of times I was thinking about the reader and what questions would the reader have as he or she is reading the story. Mm-hmm. So that's, that was kind of a motivation to try to help the story. It wasn't, kind of, Tubby Smith spoke at the launch of my memoir, and I spoke with him beforehand, and we were talking, and I said about the hard questions. I said, I wasn't trying to pin somebody against a wall. And he said, oh, yes, he understood that. I was trying to nail people against the wall. He was kidding.
Let me ask you about, go back to a publication that people our age will remember, but maybe others won't. But Reader's Digest used to have features on the most unforgettable character I've ever met. And so people would write about someone who either had been influential or for whatever reason had impacted them. So in the 41 years, whether it's somebody you worked with or a coach or a player, is there someone who would fall into that category of most unforgettable?
Well, they were so, as you know, over 41 years, there's going to be a lot of people that influence things and make an impression. One thing I thought about when you were asking that is that, of course, whoever the reporter is, their name is at the top of the story in the byline. And with me, the Sunday Notes column had my picture. And somehow people, I think, readers, have the impression that this is you, the reporter, and they don't take into account that it's a collaborative thing, that you have an editor, copy editor, you have the sports editor, you might call on colleagues to, you might have questions, maybe they can give you some perspective on things. So it's not, just the reporter scratching some itch or having some, issue with someone. It's, there's a bigger focus than that. It's collaborative.
Sure.
And for the most part, people would go along with, at the Herald-Leader, the editors, with whatever the story you thought, hey, but you would bounce it off people before starting to work on it. What do you think of this story idea? And, if they didn't warm to it, then maybe you wouldn't do it. You just set it aside.
Well, there are just an unbelievable number of stories in the book that we're not going to be able to get to today, I don't think. But the tornado at the SEC tournament that was 2000.
I think it was 2008. It was Billy Gillespie's first year.
Right, and that one was it's really a great story. You set the scene well there, and talk about how that just disrupted everything as a tornado.
My family was there, by the way.
Yeah.
My wife and our two sons were there, and I just finished reading Tom Hammond, his memoir that Mark Story of the Herald-Leader helped him with. And it does not mention the tornado.
Really?
Yeah. I think he and Larry Connolly, I believe, was his color man. I think they worked the afternoon games, and then they were at dinner when the tornado hit. So they weren't there. I'm assuming that's the reason.
Yeah.
But they were in Atlanta.
I was doing the studio work for UK, doing the scores and post-game things and those sorts of things back in the studio in Lexington. And, of course, we had to stop our broadcast, or at least after a while. There was only so much they could say after things were delayed. And I remember we had the advantage of having a TV monitor in front of us there. So I told the guys at courtside, it's going to look a lot different outside than it did when you walked in the building. So I guess we have gotten to the tornado after all, but it was quite an event.
The big thing that struck me about it was that as I remember, I checked with my wife to make sure they were okay, and then but we had to hang around the arena or the stadium to find out what's the SEC going to do.
Yeah.
So we were there until 2 or 3 in the morning, I think, waiting for that decision. And we got it, and I don't know how we reported on it back then. But anyway, then went back to the hotel, which was within walking distance. But, that's, needless to say, a very scary situation.
Yeah, that's not something you think about when you become the beat writer for University of Kentucky basketball. But there's so many basketball-related memories, things like that that are part of the history of Kentucky basketball, the tornado at the SEC tournament, but the investigation, the national championships, all the things that fans enjoy hearing about, and some of them maybe they don't enjoy hearing about, but they know that that's part of the history, and it's all part of your book. And so congratulations on a terrific job. It was really an enjoyable read.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned Sam Bowie, because I thought he was a prime example of somebody that could expand on what people remember about certain events and certain players. And I thought he was really good that way.
I wanted to ask you one final question here, and we've touched on this a number of times, but you seem to have what I might call a compass that would direct you in your career, in your work, because you're not going to be influenced by the fans necessarily, except to think about what questions they might want answered. And then, of course, you can't let the coach intimidate you, but you always seem to have that principle of working for the newspaper and the reader. Tell me a little bit about how that guided you and maybe where that developed.
Well, that, it makes me think of when I went to Marshall and became a journalism major, and I knew nothing about journalism. except I read the newspaper. That was the extent of it. So I had everything to learn, and that was one of the things that they tried to teach us. And I learned through experience about being objective and not being emotionally involved and all of that. And so I tried to follow the dictates or the instruction that I was given. It wasn't any. I think the fans want to make it a personal thing, put it on a personal level that the writer doesn't like or whatever it would be. And I was just trying to be professional and the way I was taught. And I think a lot, it's just the way it is taught, to try to do the job as best you can. And if Kentucky won, fine. I remember I was on Woody Page. He's a sports writer in Denver. I guess he has, I think this was a radio show, although it may have been a podcast. And he asked me, do you root while covering a game? And I said, I didn't want to say no, because that, I don't know, I just wasn't comfortable with that. So I said, yeah, I root. I root for a good story idea to come to mind. And then I root for an ability to execute it. If Kentucky wins, like say Nick Richards is struggling for the last several weeks, and then he's playing better in this game, I might be sitting there thinking, boy, I hope Nick hits a key shot later in the game. It'll help the story, to cement the story.
Well, there are, as I say, many great stories in the book. It's called Deja Blue, Sportswriter Reflects on 41 Seasons of Kentucky Basketball by Jerry Tipton, who did an outstanding job covering UK basketball and now has done an outstanding job with this book as well. And thanks so much for doing this today.
Well, thanks for having me, Keith. I appreciate it. And it's at Joseph Beth, and I think Barnes & Noble. And you can get it online at Amazon, or if you want me to give you the Acclaim Press website. But it's, I hope people would enjoy it. I tried to make it, like I said, give it a historical feel.
Well, I would say mission accomplished.
Well, thank you, Keith.
You've been listening to the WUKY Sports Page with your host, Keith Elkins, an exclusive podcast from 91.3 WUKY, produced at the WUKY studios by Alan Lytle. Our theme music is Peanut Butter and Jam by Illogical Bit, available at soundcloud.com/illogicalbit. Subscribe to the Sports Page through iTunes, Google Play, or at our website, wuky.org.